You are listening to programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning and good evening to all who have joined us, and I'm sure others will join as we go along. But my name is Satu Limaye. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you from wherever you're joining, at whatever time you're joining, to this book talk entitled Putin's Russia and Southeast Asia, the Kremlin's Pivot to Asia and the Impact of the Russia-Ukraine War. The book is authored by Dr. Ian Storey, and we have with us today Dr. Vitaly Kozyrev as a discussant, both of whom are acknowledged scholars and experts in the field, and we're delighted that they could join us and delighted that you could join us. Let me just give you a brief background and reminder of who our speakers are today. Dr. Ian Storey is a senior fellow and co-editor of Contemporary Southeast Asia, one of the Institute of Southeast Asia Studies' 3 academic journals. Many of you on the call will be well aware of the terrific reputation both of the journal and of the institution and of our speaker today. Ian focuses on a range of defense, security, foreign policy issues in the region, and he previously was a colleague of mine at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, and we've had a long professional and collegial interaction. Thank you, Ian, so much for joining us late in the evening in Singapore. Our discussant today is Dr. Vitaly Kozyrev. He's a distinguished professor of political science and international studies at Endicott College in Beverly, Massachusetts, and an associate in research at the Fairback Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. So he also brings expertise on East Asia, Russia, and particularly the relations between the two, and has been previously East-West Center fellow. And therefore, we were delighted to engage our distinguished alumnus in this book talk, given his expertise. The run of show is very simple. We've invited Ian to spend about 20 minutes laying out the key arguments of his book, some of the key takeaways, and then we've invited Dr. Kozyrev to give us a few, about 10 minutes of some comments and questions that he may have. And then, of course, we'll turn it over and transition to Q&A from the audience. Please use your Q&A function on the Zoom panel there below to submit your questions. And I'll try to manage that process simply because sometimes we get 2 or 3 around the same theme or a couple of repetitions. So it'll help me manage the questions for Ian and for Vitaly. We have a sharp close at 9 p.m., yes, Singapore time, 9 a.m. Honolulu, Washington time. So I want to make sure that we get as much time to hear from our experts and as much time as possible for you to engage with them. Thank you so much, and over to you, Ian.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Satu, and thanks for having me along today to talk about my new book, which was published by ISEAS in late May. I think it's an important book, primarily because it's the first single-authored book on Russia and Southeast Asia since 1992, 33 years ago. And actually that book was about the Soviet Union and Southeast Asia, as opposed to the Russian Federation and the region, because obviously Russia had only existed for a year at that time. And I also think the book's important and timely because Russia's been playing a more prominent role in Asia over the past few years, partly because of its closer relationship with China. We saw President Putin in Beijing last week and Tianjin, but mainly, of course, because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So I started working on this book in 2021. I'd been looking at Russia's role and interest in Southeast Asia for about a decade. And I decided that I would write a book about this understudied topic. And 4 years later, it's finally out. And I'm happy that it's out. And so what I'll do now is I'll spend the rest of the time talking about some of the main takeaways from the book, etc. So the book is essentially divided into 3 parts. The first part charts the evolution of Russia's foreign policy since the collapse of the Soviet Union, including Moscow's priorities during the economic and political turmoil of the 1990s. before turning to look at President Putin's worldview and the factors that have shaped his foreign policy since he took power in 2000. I've also included a whole chapter on Russia's key relationships with countries in the Asia-Pacific, including China. That's an enormously important relationship for Russia. Some would say it's the cornerstone of Putin's foreign policy, with Japan, with the two Koreas, India, and of course, Southeast Asia. The second part of the book examines, so it's 3 chapters, that second part examines specific areas in the Russia-Southeast Asia relationship. The first is Russia's rather limited economic engagement with countries in Southeast Asia. I've titled that chapter, Russia is an economic minnow among whales in Southeast Asia. The following chapter looks at Russia's dialogue partnership with ASEAN, not a bit of a problematic relationship in some ways. And the chapter after that looks at Russia's defense diplomacy in the region, primarily Russia's arms sales to Southeast Asia, which were quite lucrative in the 2000s, but have more or less collapsed since the mid-2010s. And probably won't recover anytime soon, if ever. The third part of the book, which is the main part of the book and covers 4 chapters, looks at Russia's bilateral relations with all 11 countries, and particularly how each of them responded to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So let me talk about some of the main points of the book. 4 points I want to make. So the first is that Russia sees itself as a great power, which is on a par with the US and China. And although I think Russia can be considered a great power in certain parts of the world, it cannot be considered as such in Southeast Asia. That's because at almost every level, it underperforms compared to the other major powers, the US, Japan, India, the European Union. Economically, its engagement is fairly insubstantial, as I mentioned. It's not a security provider in Southeast Asia. Its defense sales have dropped precipitously. And it's not really a very constructive dialogue partner of ASEAN either. The second point is that despite not being recognized as a great power in Southeast Asia by the countries themselves, regional states do recognize that Russia has certain global great power attributes, including, of course, its size, its population. It has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It has a seat on the UN Security Council. It has a lot of influence in the Euro-Atlantic, in the Arctic, and of course in the post-Soviet space, and has increasingly consequential ties with China. And therefore they do take it seriously. Moreover, in sharp contrast to most Western European countries, Russia has a relatively benign image in Southeast Asia. It's not perceived as a threat by any country, doesn't have any territorial or maritime boundary disputes in the region. Indeed, not only is it not seen as a threat to any country's sovereignty, some countries, particularly Vietnam, view it as an important partner in helping to protect their own sovereignty in areas such as the South China Sea. In addition to that, Russia is generally perceived by the Muslim majority states of Southeast Asia as being Islamic friendly. That's due in part to its long-standing support for Palestinian statehood. Southeast Asians have either never heard of or don't remember Russia's a war in Chechnya in the 1990s. Putin's image in Southeast Asia is quite positive. In global opinion polls that include Southeast Asian countries, President Putin's popularity rating always scores quite highly. I think people in the region do appreciate his sort of strongman image, standing up to the West, etc., etc. The third point I want to make is that when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the responses of Southeast Asian countries have been conditioned, I think, by three main factors. The first is history. And when I say history, what I'm really talking about here is the legacy of the Soviet Union rather than of the Russian Federation's role itself. The legacy of the Soviet Union is quite strong, remains quite strong in Southeast Asia because of the support it provided to anti-colonialist national liberation movements, particularly in Vietnam and Laos, of course, but also in Indonesia under Sukarno in the 1960s. In the case of Vietnam and Laos, it's the main reason why they've refrained from criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also consistently abstained on votes at the United Nations General Assembly, which have condemned Russia's actions. The second factor is conditioning responses is the various countries' adherence to principles and international law. Now, clearly, that is the reason why Singapore took a very strong position. It was it condemned Russia by name and was the only country in Southeast Asia to impose unilateral financial sanctions on Russia. Now, Myanmar is at the opposite end of the scale. Myanmar is the only country that endorsed the invasion. Clearly, international law principles not of great consequence to the military junta in Myanmar. Most of the others voted in support of the UN General Assembly resolutions, but that was pretty much the limit of their disapproval. And in some cases, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, they have criticized the West for what they say is the West's double standards or hypocrisy. They compare what Russia did in Ukraine with what the United States and its allies did in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s. And those accusations of double standards have been greatly amplified since Israel invaded Gaza in October of last year. So basically, both President Prabowo of Indonesia and Prime Minister Anwar of Malaysia have said, look, the West's been very quick to condemn Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, but has not done the same regarding Israel's atrocities in Gaza. The third factor that has shaped regional responses is national interests. So they vary quite widely. In the case of Myanmar, since the coup in 2021, has turned to Russia for diplomatic support, for military assistance, for help to ease the country's energy crisis, including oil and even nuclear power. Thailand took a very transactional approach to the conflict. The government at the time said, look, this conflict is far away, it doesn't concern us, and none of our interests are really at stake here. And we see Russia as a potentially important economic partner, particularly Russian tourists who have visited Thailand's beach resorts in their thousands since the beginning of the war. Vietnam and Laos, I mentioned, very grateful for the Soviet Union's support during the Cold War. They'll never criticize Russia, but they're also dependent on Russia for the upkeep of their armed forces, which remain primarily equipped with Russian-supplied military equipment. I'd add as well that there's some empathy for Russian narratives in Southeast Asia over why it invaded Ukraine, especially that Russia was provoked because the West offered it membership of NATO, that Ukraine is a proxy of the West, Zelensky is a puppet of the United States and Britain, etc., etc. These are the typical Russian narratives we hear about the conflict. And in some places in Southeast Asia, these have been met with some empathy. So the fourth point I want to make is about Russia's turn to the East. This was a policy that was introduced in 2012 when, after Russia's relationship with the West had soured, The aim of the pivot to Asia was to reduce Russia's economic dependence on Europe, to strengthen economic ties, political ties with Asian countries, and also to get Asian countries to invest in places like Siberia and the Russian Far East. So this policy, Russia did make some gains in Southeast Asia. Trade with the 10 ASEAN members did go up. It rose steadily. Russia began to play a bigger role in ASEAN-led forums such as the East Asia Summit, although Putin has only attended once in person, and the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting. Plus, the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union signed FTAs with Vietnam and with Singapore, and Russia seemed on the verge of clinching some major arms deals in the region, including with 2 US allies, Thailand and the Philippines. But these gains, as I argue in the book, they proved rather ephemeral. A two-way trade peaked at about 22 billion in 2014 and has since hovered around the 15 billion mark since that time. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and the West imposed financial sanctions and export controls that particularly targeted Russia's defense industrial sector, Russia's arms sales to the region declined quite significantly, not only to Southeast Asia, but around the world as well, because doubts were raised about Russia's reliability as an arms provider. During the pandemic, its vaccine diplomacy was a bit of a flop. Even though Russia was one of the first to develop a vaccine, the Sputnik V, it overpromised and it underdelivered on its vaccine supplies. When it comes to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, I think it's a mixed picture for Russia. I think the Kremlin can be generally satisfied that most regional states have adopted an essentially neutral position, that its relationship with ASEAN has been almost completely unaffected, despite the fact that the invasion was an egregious violation of all the principles enshrined in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which Russia endorsed in 2004. As I mentioned earlier, there's also been a degree of empathy for some of Russia's security concerns, especially the expansion of NATO and this issue of the West having double standards vis-a-vis Ukraine and the Gaza conflict. I think Russia can also be quite satisfied that Western attempts to isolate Russia internationally have not been successful in Southeast Asia. In fact, since February 2022, 7 Southeast Asian leaders have met with President Putin in person. Some of them have traveled to Russia itself. In June of last year, President Putin came to visited Vietnam. And last year, when Russia was chair of the BRICS organization, 4 Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, applied for membership of BRICS, either as a partner or as a full member. They were all successful in their membership applications. This all happened under Russia's chairmanship. It didn't seem to put off any of the countries who applied that Russia was chairman at this time. And of course, just last week, we saw several Southeast Asian countries attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, again, where they also were able to meet with President Putin in person. So I'm going to stop there, Satu, and I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. A terrific laydown of some of the key points from your book, some of the key findings, and I have a comment and a couple questions, and I know others will too. So thank you so much, and we'll now turn to Vitaly for his thoughts and questions as well. Vitaly, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Limaye and Dr. Storey. So yes, it's a great comprehensive analysis of the account of the Russia's of the Russian turn to the east, and part of the turn to the east is the Russian relationship with the Southeast Asian nations. So I have to highlight probably a few remarkable observations in this, which I found in this book, which I'd like to point to, and then maybe formulate maybe three important moments that could be drawn from the book. So in this approach, I believe that a very strong, actually part of the book is the analysis of how the Russia-Ukraine war had impacted the Southeast Asian region, the East Asian in general, and what implications of the Russia-Ukraine war had for the Russia-Southeast Asia relations and the global security in general. So that's an important, actually, background, which is very, topical today for any analysis of, international interactions, international relations. Second is the great analysis book provides a great analysis of the perceptional aspects of Russia's status in the region, especially in the context of a global battle for discursive power. Right, so that explains some gains that Russia has received in terms of projecting its discursive power, including in the region of Southeast Asia. Was very interesting to read the Soviet legacy and anything about memory diplomacy. I think that's part of this discursive power that actually we need to emphasize again. The author looked at the value of the relationship for either party, which is also great for any student of international relations, especially studying the Indo-Pacific region. Looked at the interesting observation of Russia as a potential hedging option for the states of Southeast Asia, or the ASEAN states. That's a big question, to what extent actually Russia could be considered as a party to refer to especially for the middle and smaller nations, smaller states in the contestation between the United States and China. And the final thing is like this book examined within the framework of Russia's recent anti-colonial rhetoric in its battle for the global South, as well as Soviet support for national liberation. So that is amazing, actually, is a very important, aspect, which probably needs to be further studied and elaborated on. So three moments I would like to be drawn from the book. First is we have seen in this book how the role of Southeast Asian nations and ASEAN in particular has evolved from being instrumental and from instrumentalism and pragmatism of Russia's strategy or Russia's policy towards Southeast Asia to being a part of an unfolding battle for the global South. So that's what we actually need to take into account. Second is I'd like to remember that actually we have the qualitative shift in Russia-China relations, especially after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, February 2022. And we see, and the author has highlighted the nature of the Russia-China alignment, calling the alignment a quasi-alliance. I agree with this fully. And the relationship should be examined, and the relationship is examined in the book against the backdrop of a Russia-China condominium in Eurasia. So I would say that probably to find the answers to questions, and sometimes surprising for the author, right? Oh, why has the ASEAN or have the ASEAN states not being supportive of the Western policies of sanctions against Russia, or have not been active in terms of condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine? We just need to look into how the joint efforts by China and Russia have actually increased their, I would say, discursive power first, and probably also structural power second, among the nations of the Southeast Asia. I have five actually important, very quickly, initiatives or undertakings conducted by Russia and China, which might be considered as some sort of source of attraction on the side of the Southeast Asian nations toward those undertakings. First, Russia and China together jointly have proposed the revision of the global normative agenda and institutional foundation of the world order. Second, both Beijing and Moscow have been fostering some unification ideas of unifying the world versus, as they say, that Western allegedly like efforts to divide the world, by means of bloc mentality and just different actions, alliance building, and so on and so forth. Third is both Russia and China have been investing heavily into the formation of a new ecosystem, which is based mostly on the BRICS Plus and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Recently, we had a summit as a kind of coercion-free platform for those countries which are not very much satisfied with the Western-led hegemonic order. Fourth, Russia and China have been promoting new interpretation of the economy security nexus. If China was trying to, a few years ago, to separate security and economic issues, now we have seen, obviously, both Russia and China's support of security issues as a prerequisite for economic developmental initiatives and economic prosperity. And five is a new regional global security architecture. Regional and global security architecture are proposed by Russia and China. We have to mention the Eurasian security architecture, and Putin visited North Korea in June 2024, signing a treaty with North Korea, just revitalizing the alliance between Russia and North Korea, and also visited Vietnam. And that was the initial steps for building that actually Eurasian security architecture. I would say that this initiative has been very much in par or synchronized with Xi Jinping's early security initiatives, especially in the context of the SICA confidence building measures and all those initiatives actually formulated in 2014. Right. So in terms of if we look at these aspects, we probably could see that Russia is in coordination with China, seems to win the battle for discursive power in the region. So when the author says that, yeah, there are some popular perceptions of Russia and Putin remains surprisingly positive, I think this could be easily explained, well explained, if we consider those new actually nuances in terms of coordinated Russia and China strategies toward the region. So I have, in this context, I have a couple of questions. So first question to the author. First question is, we have seen some material that actually when those Southeast Asian nations and ASEAN nations in particular developed their position toward the war in Ukraine, some material actually provided some information about China's position, and that the China's position played a probably pivotal role in influencing the position of those leadership of those Southeast Asian nations. So what would actually the author say about this? So can we consider the Southeast Asian position of pro-Russian neutrality as a kind of extension of China's position of pro-Russian neutrality? And second question, I've noticed that the author has has provided some information about how Russia has undermined the ASEAN centrality. But I think that this ASEAN centrality, which is ASEAN in the driver's seat, I think this aspect is very important in terms of big rivalry between Russia/China against the United States and its allies, accusing the United States of undermining ASEAN centrality And now the United States is saying, and the author is saying that actually Russia is by certain actions has been undermining the ASEAN centrality. I think this is the very important aspect, because the return to ASEAN centrality, to emphasizing ASEAN centrality in the security and economic development agenda in the region might be very essential for maintaining stability and balance in the region. Thank you.
Vitaly, thanks so much, and really appreciate you bringing China into this discussion, because it was one of the questions I have. And as we wait for our colleagues online who are joining us for today's seminar, I encourage you to think of comments or questions you may wish to pose to one or both of our wonderful experts today. Let me start with one general comment. And I'm sorry, Ian, I've not yet had a chance to read fully the book, but have skimmed through some of the chapters in the PDF that was sent to me. You know, it's quite fascinating as an American to hear Southeast Asia's responses about Russia, as you articulated, particularly its responses to Ukraine. We are quite used to, or mostly used to in the US these days, looking at Southeast Asia's responses in the context of US-China relations. And I think having your contributions of how Southeast Asia sees Russia is a very, very useful addition to understanding how Southeast Asia sees the world, not just Russia, but you know, how we in the US should understand some of Southeast Asia's position. So I just simply wanted to make the comment that its responses to the Ukraine war, some of the narrative issues you talked about, the benign attitudes towards Russia were very interesting to me. My questions were really one large one, which kind of Vitaly has a very I was very intrigued by Vitaly's sort of linking Russia-China relations to Southeast Asia policy. And I was going to ask you really in your talk about Putin's foreign policy and its great power status and its turn towards the East, what was the China driver? Is Southeast Asia in any way an attempt to not align fully with China or to give Russia space vis-a-vis China? Or, as Vitaly seemed to suggest, more alignment with China and kind of coordination with China? And I wondered what your thoughts on that sort of meta question. I had also one very small specific question, Ian, and that is, I thought I heard you say that arms sales won't recover. But you did mention that Russia has some solid Vietnam, Laos, you know, a couple other relationships, some niche sales to Malaysia in the past for MiGs and other things. And I just wondered what your thoughts and reasoning was for why you do not believe that Russian arms sales could recover, because I've been dealing with some of this in the context of Russia-India relations. And while there are definitely issues, problems, concerns ongoing for many years, the Indians appear to be fairly confident that they will be able to get arms supplies. And in fact, in the emerging order, are very much likely. And then to both Vitaly and Ian, I'm sorry, I can't help but asking, based in Washington and being an American, will the current US administration's approach to Southeast Asia / global order, global South, BRICS, you know, you name it, you all know, will this change significantly Russia's approach, or is Russia's approach an independent to what the US approach to the region or some of these key issues are? I mean, does it matter, or is Russia really looking at niche outcomes in Southeast Asia and not prioritizing it? Or will they really seek to capitalize on opportunities that may or may not present themselves to Russia because of the US approach on certain issues? Thanks very much, and I hope other colleagues online will add to the discussion and questions. So maybe start with Ian.
Well, thanks, Satu, and thanks, Vitaly, for those comments. Very interesting. I'm glad you focused a lot of your comments on Russia's image in the global South, because essentially the book is about Russia's relationship with 11 countries that I think we can say are in the global South. And this, of course, has influenced their response to the war in Ukraine. I think also it's important to point out that when we talk about BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they are attractive to some Southeast Asian countries, not all Southeast Asian countries. That's not necessarily, in fact, it's not about Russia at all, I think. I think it's about two things. One is the sheer economic power of China, which countries in the region obviously want to take advantage of. And the second is this renewed interest in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think is a symptom of countries in the global south, their increasing dissatisfaction with the lack of reform of international institutions. And that's why they have expressed an interest in joining them. But even when we look at BRICS, we look at the 4 Southeast Asian countries that applied for membership. They all really applied for very different reasons. Thailand did it for economic reasons because of China's leading role in BRICS. Vietnam did it, I think, because, well, Russia's an old friend, right? But it hasn't become a founding member of BRICS. I think that because it takes into account its relationship with the European Union and the United States. Indonesia joined because President Prabowo said, look, we claim to have a independent foreign policy, but I think our country's foreign policy has leaned towards the West a little bit too much over the past few decades. We need to correct that by strengthening. One way we can do that is strengthen our relations with both China and Russia. And oh, by the way, we've applied for membership of the OECD. So in order to have some balance there, we've applied for BRICS membership as well. And for Malaysia, I think for Prime Minister Anwar, he sees BRICS as an important platform that will give the global south a stronger voice in international affairs. So again, 4 quite different approaches to why they joined BRICS, and not really about Russia at all. In fact, it's about the global system, or it's about China. You posed a few questions. I'll just try and answer them briefly. Did China's role towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine have any influence on Southeast Asian countries? I think the answer to that is no, a resounding no. As I mentioned, the 3 factors that have conditioned the responses were history, their relationship particularly with the Soviet Union, but also with Russia. Secondly, the importance of international law and principles. And thirdly, their national interests, which really boil down to economic interests. I think a really interesting case study in this respect is Cambodia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, everybody expected Cambodia to abstain at the United Nations General Assembly, including the Cambodian Foreign Ministry. But their ambassador in New York received a phone call from Hun Sen, Prime Minister Hun Sen, who was Prime Minister at the time, basically saying, not only will you not abstain on this issue, you will co-sponsor the resolution against Russia. And again, Hun Sen, he'd taken a very principled position. He said, look, our sovereignty, Cambodia's sovereignty, has been violated in the past by other countries. He didn't say specifically which one, but we can think of several, in fact. He said, this cannot be allowed to stand, and therefore we're going to vote in support of the UN resolutions. Now, apparently, Xi Jinping had called Hun Sen a few days before the vote, and perhaps, we don't know what they talked about, but it seems like he was trying to persuade Hun Sen to vote, to abstain, and he said no. Let me get to some of the other questions here. I'm not sure, Satu, were you talking about Russia-China coordination in Southeast Asia?
What I was referring to is I thought I heard Vitaly, and Vitaly could speak for himself. I thought the Russia-China framing that you did, Vitaly, seemed to suggest quite a lot of coordination in Moscow, thinking about that coordination. And I was a little surprised I wanted to know what the balance between coordinating with Beijing on some of these 5 issues that you raised, Vitaly, versus Ian's take on, in Russia's great power vision, in Russia's look east policy, in Russia's more recent foreign policy adjustments under Putin. What is the China factor in its relations with Southeast? Does it not matter at all? What's on the spectrum between no impact and coordination?
Russia and China share some goals in Southeast Asia. Their primary shared goal is to thwart U.S. primacy in the international system. And that includes America's alliances and partnerships with Southeast Asian countries. So on that, they're in lockstep. But on other issues, they're not in alignment. Russia and China are not in alignment totally on Central Asia, on the Arctic, and as I discuss in the book, the South China Sea, because Russia has been a very active participant in Vietnam's oil and gas industry in its exclusive economic zone. And the Chinese have leaned very heavily on Russia over the years in an attempt to get them to downsize or even terminate these economic relationships with Vietnam. And the Russians have pushed back and said, no, because these are lucrative projects. It's basically, our most important foothold in Southeast Asia. And also, we can't be seen to be giving in to pressure from China, because that undermines our narrative that Russia is an independent pole of the US and China, and great powers don't buckle under the pressure from other major powers. Russian arms sales, so the height of Russia's arms sales to Southeast Asia were in 2011. They sold roughly $1.6 billion worth of equipment. Last year, that had fallen to about 100 million, which is very small in terms of global arms sales, largely because its number one customer, Vietnam, has stopped buying from Russia. Now, this predates the 2022 invasion. It goes back to 2014, where Russia was building some corvettes for Vietnam, and the Ukrainians refused to hand over the engines, and the Vietnamese had to go to Ukraine and get the engines themselves. And the whole thing was a disaster. I mean, the ships were eventually commissioned, but this was a red flag to the Vietnamese. They're like, okay, Russia's no longer this, the reliable partner that it once was. Will it ever recover? Well, look, Southeast Asian countries, as with many other issues, they have a lot of choices. Myanmar doesn't. Myanmar has two choices. It's Russia and China. But all the other countries, well, they can buy their arms equipment from Europe, the United States, South Korea, increasingly, Turkey. Turkey is making big inroads into the region, particularly with Indonesia and Malaysia. So they have a lot of choice. They also want to develop their own defense industries. Countries like South Korea can offer them equipment that are technologically very good, but also cheaper than the West can provide. There's no strings attached as well with South Korean arms sales to Southeast Asia. It's a purely a business transaction. And also Russia's defense industry has suffered quite a bit reputationally since 2022 because of the huge losses that the Russian armed forces have suffered in Ukraine, including their tanks and their aircraft and their helicopters. So will it ever recover? I'm not so sure. There's rumors have been around for a while that Vietnam is on the verge of placing a major order with the Russians, possibly for fighter aircraft, but we'll see. I mean, the Russian defense industry still faces enormous problems with sanctions and export controls. Excuse me. And even if you want to buy something from Russia, how do you actually pay for it with the financial sanctions still in place? And it will take a long time for these sanctions to be unwound. So I'll stop there and perhaps hand over back to Vitaly.
Yeah, Vitaly, why don't you answer couple of things? And then we have three questions in the Q&A I want to get to as well, and then give you.
Yes. Okay. So first on the coordination issue, we have seen some sort of trade-off throughout the last 25 years because the book has been studying the kind of Putin era. And we have seen some sort of coordination and kind of trade-off between China and Russia in terms of China's involvement into Central Asia, which had long been considered as Russia's underbelly, soft underbelly, and the spheres of influence for Russia. And as a reciprocal gesture, China's kind of tacit consent on Russia's activism in Southeast Asia, and Russia tried not to undermine directly China's interests. So Russia has been trying to put forward some initiatives within the framework of the Eurasian Economic Union, kind of multilateral formats, so that China would not feel itself kind of being sidelined in this from this. So, but I would say that not everything is endorsed by China or Russia if it is happening in Central Asia or if it is happening in Southeast Asia. But paradoxically, that after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Central Asian states have become much less kind of amicable toward Russia. Unlike the Southeast Asian states, maybe because of the geographical factor, right? Because they are all concerned about some, possible implications should Russia wins the war in Ukraine for their own national identity and territorial integrity. So that is a question. That's why they're trying to actually balance and sit on the fence. And they have been helping Russia in terms of, indirect imports of some stuff from other countries, but and also banking services, financial services. But it is not now the best, probably the best outcome for Russia in terms of Russia's influence in Central Asia. But it is, many publications are saying that it is a good outcome for China. So China has been returning to Central Asia and very active and very influential over there. Another aspect is, given the U.S.-China rivalry or confrontation, I would say that China could allow some activities of Russia, including in South China Sea with Vietnam, just because, and also arms sales to those Southeast Asian nations, just because maybe for China it's much more preferable compared with the direct, alliance or with direct actually interactions and deals with the United States. So China has to kind of tolerate this, right? Once I asked one of the ambassadors, former ambassadors of China to Russia, about this, and he said, "We just don't ask." I said, "What is your attitude toward Vietnam, Russia, economic cooperation in South China Sea area?" And he just said, "We don't ask. We just don't raise this question." So trying to kind of not to actually focus on this question. And about actually Dr. Limaye's question about today's United States policies toward the region, which I believe demonstrates a shift from even the Biden administration's policies focused on the kind of reintegration with the Southeast Asian region, including the many economic programs, and whether Russia will actually change its approach or capitalize on the opportunity. I would say that Russia, in coordination with China again, are very much against bipolarization. So they don't want to see those nations being split between the two poles or two centers of power. And then because for Russia and China to reestablish the bipolar confrontation is very detrimental for their interests. They believe that they cannot sustain this country. It's not the Soviet Union. It's not the equal kind of balance of power between the unified consolidated West and the consolidated China-centered kind of bloc, if the bloc is being established. Second is all the initiatives that China and Russia have promoted and proposed are inclusive. So they do not sideline, they do not attempt to sideline the United States or United States allies in the Pacific. So that's important, except for the Eurasian Security Initiative, because as Lavrov used to say, the Russian foreign minister, the Eurasian Security Initiative is just an alternative to the transatlantic-based security architecture. So that might be something which is might raise some alert and concerns in Washington about America might be sidelined if Russia/China's Eurasian Architecture Initiative really receives some positive responses, not only among the Southeast Asian nations, but also among the South Korea, like allies of the United States, South Korea, Japan. And my belief is that this initiative is also addressed to the European Union, right? So, and saying, hey, we can agree on some security architecture here and the code of conduct within Eurasia, even without interference from the United States. So that is an interesting aspect. And also, I have noticed that even in Singapore, there are widespread like thoughts about creating a community without the United States. It's kind of like -1. You probably have heard about this. So that is the very important thing. So, and the last point, yes, Russia could actually utilize and capitalize on the opportunity because in Russia, many economists consider the Southeast Asian region as the very promising market for the future development. They consider the United States and the European Union, the European markets are like facing some sort of turbulence, if not imminent crisis. And that's why they believe that, yes, we need to coordinate with China. We need to actually jointly develop these markets and utilize the opportunities, especially against the backdrop of the crisis of the so-called neoliberal model. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitaly. Let's go to the questions from the Q&A, and we have only about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to just sort of frame these. The first two are both kind of riffing, it seems to me, off of Ian's point about how Southeast Asia views the Russia-Ukraine war. So the first, as other people can see the question, Putin is killing Ukrainians as assuredly as Hitler killed Slavs and Jews. Where is the moral revulsion of Southeast Asians? Why is it that only Singaporeans feel disgusted? And the second question after that is really about a double standard on Gaza and the Ukraine. And I wondered, because you dealt a lot with Southeast Asia's responses to Ukraine and the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Ian, if maybe you could do a quick response to that before we turn to John Brandon's question and another one on Russia's independence strategy. Go ahead, Ian.
Okay, thank you. I think it's not fair to say that there was no moral revulsion in Southeast Asia when Russia invaded Ukraine. It was a great shock. Countries in the region, many couldn't believe that Russia had done this. Some decided not to condemn Russia by name, partly because they don't want to get involved in the disputes of the major powers, but most of them did vote for the UN General Assembly resolutions, which did condemn Russia's attack. So in that sense, they did condemn it. Also, there's been a lot of humanitarian support for Ukraine, both from governments and from the populations, local populations. They've raised a lot of money. They've sent ambulances and fire trucks and food and that kind of thing. So a degree of empathy as well for Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and in some parts of Southeast Asia, people do remember that, particularly in Vietnam. And therefore, that Ukraine was part of the effort that helped them become independent. The second question, the double standard question, is it restricted to Southeast Asia? No, not at all. I think this is particularly in the global South, this feeling that the West has demonstrated double standards over Gaza and Ukraine. Often it's put down to purely racial terms, that Ukrainians are white, they're Caucasians, or Slavs, whatever, but they're white. And that is why the West has been so supportive of them, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we can move on.
Thank you, Ian. You also have a question, Ian, specifically posed to you, I think, about from our good colleague and friend John Brandon
Yes.
about Thailand. I wondered if you could just say a little bit about sort of some of the negative
Yes, sure.
externalities of Russian tourism and Russian engagement.
Yes, thanks for that question, John. Nice to hear from you again. You're absolutely right. Russian tourists to Thailand have created some social problems. They've overstayed their visas. They've worked illegally. They set up an international school in Phuket without any permission from the Thai government, and so on and so forth. You know, they've been alleged to be disrespectful at temples and that kind of thing. I think, but the Thai's authorities have been dealing with this from tourists from all over the world, particularly I think Western tourists, for a long time. They put up with it. They put up with it because the tourism dollar, it brings in a lot of money for Thailand. The Thais are the Russians now one of the largest buyers of luxury condos in Phuket and some other places. So they're willing to put up with this. I think in the case of Thailand, it's because the civilian government feels that it has a lot of catching up to do after so many years of what they see as economic mismanagement by the military, hence joining BRICS, OECD, and other things as well.
Thank you, Ian.
By the way, the same kinds of antisocial behaviors we also see from Russian tourists in Bali. But again, for a long time, Australian tourists were quite famous for those kinds of activities in Bali. So nothing new in that sense.
Thank you, Ian. And John, thanks for your question. The final question was posed, and we've been discussing a lot about it, sort of given Russia's role, is it kind of tied with China partnership or a junior partner or carving out autonomous influence? I know Vitaly dealt a lot. It was kind of the basis of my question about on the spectrum, where is Russia? Is it really independent, autonomous, or is it really coordinating? And given the changes in the global system, global South, US approaches, there was always a dynamism and, ebb and flow of this stuff, but where can we see it trending? More autonomy for Moscow in Southeast Asia, less as it coordinates more with China?
Yeah, I think that we need to forget about the previous connotation of the so-called strategic autonomy, and it is more dependent on China. I agree with this. Could we consider Russia as a junior partner in the region? I would say so. Yeah, I would say that Russia now is a junior partner in the region. Russia tries to, utilize and just build its relationship, as I said, in a multilateral format, so that it will not look like Russia is always following China. But also China understands this, that Russia doesn't want to feel like it is dependent on China. So they put forward some joint initiatives, much more regional and much more holistic, so that everybody would feel that Russia has an independent course.
Thank you, Vitaly. Ian, what's your thoughts on this? Do you agree with Vitaly?
In the final few seconds, I would say it's, obviously China has a huge role in Southeast Asia, economically, diplomatically, politically, etc. But it's not in China's gift to allow or disallow Russia a role in the region. Russia, as I argue in the book, has had a long-standing relationship with Southeast Asian countries, going back in some cases much further than China, because China was quite isolated during the Cold War. So it's not in China's gift. And as I mentioned earlier, the Russians have a vested interest in showing that they're not the junior partner of China anywhere, and including in Southeast Asia, and that they have their own agency, and that they will pursue their own interests. And as I mentioned, the South China Sea is a very good example of that. They have pushed back against Chinese pressure to end their economic activities in Vietnam.
Well, thank you. And on that note of the kind of tension between Russia's autonomy / independence and its junior partner status vis-a-vis China, which is, we will keep watch. There'll be a lot more dynamics on this, but we're so grateful, Ian, to you for writing this book, for agreeing to have this book talk at the East-West Center in Washington. And Vitaly, as a former fellow here, we're delighted to have you back and engage on this important subject. And of course, to our wonderful colleagues who joined us online, thank you for spending your time with us. And of course, to my good colleague who made this all possible, Miss Abigail Hull, thank you for coordinating this. With that, I wish everyone a good evening, good morning, good day, and look forward to seeing you for East-West Center activities in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Satu. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Satu.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Thank you.